first necessary to delineate the contours of this inquiry, to grapple with the simultaneous precondition and impossibility of conceptual enclosure. The unrelenting crux of the argument presented here resides in the counterintuitive destabilization of identity as such, not merely as a phenomenon, but as the architectonic univocity of a priori dissonance. The term resonance, albeit inadequate, shall stand as the provisional vessel for this exploration, bearing the undue weight of implicating a consonance that must perpetually undo itself to constitute its own potentiality. Thus we proceed with this fractal heuristic, knowing it may never cohere. In the realm of what we might term subsumed particulars, there is an incessant folding, a doubling back, whereby the very act of delineating a singularity effaces its claim to being. Subsumption then is not the absorption of particularity into universality, but its deferral, its perpetual becoming other within the constraints of a horizon it can neither exceed nor inhabit fully. Particulars become particular only through their annulment as such, their dissolution into the flux of negated affinities, those relational non-relations that do not relate so much as they instantiate the impossibility of any relation. Affinity here does not connote proximity or kinship, but the convulsive disjunction that organizes being through its own fragmentation. To posit an affinity between terms, one must reckon with the ceaseless implosion of such terms into their contraries. The semblance of being toward another is but the performance of a perpetual self-alienation. To be is paradoxically not to be. It is to exist as the negation of any stable ontology. What then does it mean to affirm resonance? It is not harmony in the classical sense, but rather the fractal reverberation of asymmetries that refuse synthesis. Resonance is that which propagates itself only by dismantling the framework of propagation. It is recursive, not as a cycle or repetition, but as the infinite self-othering of its own premise. To grasp this, one must discard the presumption of epistemic linearity. The unfolding of knowledge, insofar as it is tethered to the exigencies of causal antinomies, must be understood as the recursive convolution of cause and effect, whereby causality itself becomes unmoored from temporality, collapsing into an atemporal causation. This is not to say that causality is eradicated. Rather, it is reconstituted as the precondition for its own impossibility. In this way, the causal chain ceases to be a chain and becomes instead a lattice of non-contiguous interpenetrations, each node a contradiction that sublates its neighbors through the act of negation. If this sounds absurd, it is only because language fails to embody the dynamism of this process. The lexicon here is both indispensable and wholly inadequate. To speak of subsumed particulars and negated affinities is to flirt with the boundaries of what can be said, knowing full well that these terms calcify what ought to remain fluid. The philosopher must become a conjurer of impossibilities, an architect of dissonant harmonies, perpetually destroying the edifices they erect. The terms themselves must resonate, must tremble with the anxiety of their own insufficiency. Now consider the totality, not as a static whole, but as the pulsating substratum of negation itself. Totality is not a summation, it is a disaggregation that masquerades as unity. It contains particulars only insofar as it annihilates them, reducing them to the echoes of their own absence. The totality is the site where resonance achieves its apotheosis, where the recursive interplay of negated affinities becomes the groundless ground of all that is. To speak of totality, therefore, is to invoke the vanishing point of discourse, the asymptote of all conceptualization. It is within this matrix that the human subject finds itself, not as a stable entity, but as a node of recursion, an aperture through which the flux of causal antinomies becomes momentarily visible. The subject is not merely in the totality, it is the totality, albeit refracted through the prism of its own finitude. Here lies the paradox. The subject exists only insofar as it does not exist. Its being is its non-being, its presence a perpetual oscillation between self and other, identity and difference, affirmation and negation. One might be tempted to ask, What is the purpose of such an inquiry? But this question betrays the very essence of what is being explored. Purpose is a construct born of linear causality, of the naive belief in ends and means. In the realm of recursive resonance, there is no purpose, only process. To seek a purpose is to impose a teleology upon that which transcends it, to force coherence upon the incoherent. The task then is not to understand, but to participate, to resonate with the resonance, to become attuned to the rhythm of negation that underlies all being. To conclude, if such a term can even apply, the Ophidian flux of causal antinomies invites not comprehension, but transformation. It demands that the philosopher abandon the pretense of mastery, embracing instead the perpetual unmaking of their own thought. It is a dance of dissolution, a choreography of collapse. And yet, it is in this very collapse that we find the closest approximation to truth, a truth that is not a static proposition, but a living process forever undoing itself in the act of becoming. Such is the resonance of subsumed particulars within the totality of negated affinities.